but you are a bad boy Yardie. And bad boy Yardies are supposed to know how to get rid of bodies.
Racism is a central conflict in the fragile relations between races, cultures, and cities. The lore establishes the overall atmosphere of Gemstone 4 and influences interactions seen in in-game storylines, character interpretations, NPC behavior, bios, ambiance, and character descriptions, all of which reflect what is written, crafted in the core story of Elanthia and the conflicts between races. Gemstone's world highlights racial tension, rooted in historical interactions between cultures and global events. This should be something that we all agree on, this should be a straightforward conclusion, and this should be the end of this part of the video. GM Wyme's statement recognized the situation and its challenges. The confident tone of his remarks gave me hope and confidence in identifying the problem and finding a solution. However, that effort is pointless if we can't even agree on whether racism exists in the lore's fabric, its mechanics, and the environment, and that remains an issue of debate. It is this refusal to face what is presented and come to a consensus, whether from deliberate ignorance or other reasons, that has limited the possibility of reasonable changes or adjustments, or at least diminished the effects of them. Accusations of projection, gaslighting, reaching, and little deflections only worsen the situation. Over the years, many conflicts between players and GMs have occurred, and it wasn't until some of the most toxic in-game environments and ambience were exposed that a meaningful discussion was sparked. Without that, and without those exchanges, I don't think this conversation would have gone as deep. Part 1 of Racial Strife aims to accomplish 3 goals. The first, provide a clear definition of racism, both in and out of game. Second, give clear examples of the various forms of racism throughout multiple aspects of the game and in the world of Elanthia. And third, address and refute counterclaims and criticisms that either deny or misunderstand its various forms. So let's start with the definition of what racism is. As you have seen in this video, there are several definitions of racism scrolling on the screen, but I will be sticking with one particular definition and using that to establish the racial strife in Elanthia and in Gemstone 4. Racism, noun, prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, community, or institution against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized, or the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics, abilities, or qualities, especially so as to distinguish them as inferior or superior to one another. When this simple, clear fact is pointed out, people still try to debate and debunk this point. They state that this is based off of fictional species or fictional attributes. They argue that elves and halflings do not exist in the real world, pointing to their physical differences and classifications. Therefore, in their minds, racism is different because it centers on this non-existent attribute. First off, we're talking about racism in game, not racism in the real world. Well, we'll get to that because there is a parallel there. Secondly, this is a very limited view of how racism functions. The definition that I provided itself debunks the fictional features argument due to those features being used by races as indicators of superiority or inferiority, leading to practices of racism and discrimination on multiple levels. For the record, as a comparison to the real world, yes, the function is often on skill and color as the main factor, but it is not the only factor. It can also involve things like the texture of hair, shape of our eyes, width of our nose, size of our lips, body compositions, and so on. So while the existence of foot hair is not a common occurrence, Gemstone's racism often involves highlighting differences and using them as a label to group some people negatively. Using unconventional body traits to downplay racial impact is a poor excuse because it emphasizes difference as a flaw in the person, culture, or race. Disparaging someone for pointy ears or wings and then using the "it doesn't exist" excuse is an unjust way to justify accepting such behavior. If anything, it fosters the idea that discrimination is acceptable as long as it doesn't involve attributes others find problematic, which in itself is racist. As for the skin color aspect, Gemstone 4 leans on that too, but I'll touch base on that later on in this essay. Now let's get something straight right here, right now. This is not condemning the people that created the lore, the GMs that played along with it, or the players that dubbed into it with their characters. and I'm willing to offer solutions and directions for addressing these issues later on in the essays and future videos. However, I'm here to point out the cold, hard truth that targeting attributes for discrimination is the same as it is in the real world, regardless of how fictional those features are. This does not mean Gemstone or media as a whole should avoid addressing these differences or themes. Rather, they are valuable for lessons in deep exploration. They enable characters to develop through various perspectives and communities to accept or oppose change. They make for dynamic roleplay, and on a deeper level, players can explore, celebrate some of the progress made, and mourn and lament some of the practices that persist. It has always been my hope that we do not shy away from these topics. It is my hope that we engage in these battles. Yet, honesty is essential to reaching meaningful resolutions in roleplay. Regarding that intent, the more I learn about the lore regarding Gemstone and its racial strife, the more I grow irritated by the players and some of the GM's denial of these harsh elements. When I started this, I only had a few bullet points. Just off the top of my head, you'll see the list here. But the more I learned about it and more as the years went on, I learned more things, and they were more damning, more gross, and more severe. Look, to keep it transparent, I thought it was just based off of some of the world tensions and some of the battles, the emergence of sorcery, the slavery issues with the Dainar. I thought it was a little bit of the Tavalorian views and some of the things involving the half-elves, and including things like Nutah Fandril and the treatment of half-elves and stuff like that, and then definitely some of the Empire things. But I didn't know how heavy people went into it. I didn't know how strict and stringent these laws were. I didn't know how long these events occurred at the time. And just to give you perspective, my list was basically half of this. And to be honest, this doesn't even cover the gist of all of the stuff that's going on. If I did that, and I continued to dig and search, I'd be here forever. And so I'm pointing out some of the main glaring things and pointing out the different types of racism that are there, while getting ready to explain some of the further problems that have occurred in a game where people are trying to tell people like me and others that there is no racism in this game, or that we're mistaken as to what racism is. The people that make the argument that racism is not the same in Gemstone because it's not based on color will find that argument takes a horrible turn when we explore the feud between elves and dark elves. Now, prior to this construction, I did not know about the ice lore, and that dark elves were called such originally because of their alignment and not based on their skin tone. And this makes sense, as their penchant for sorcery and the tragedy of Ashram are the focal points of this animosity between them and the other elven houses. And, in theory, it does make for a compelling story. The execution, however, left a lot to be desired. After ice, the lore changed to Rosh Kator, altering the skin complexion of dark elves and sharpening their facial features.
The other thing is that the color became a stigma. American society made the Negro's color a stigma, and that can never be overlooked. So I think these things are absolutely necessary.
I do not know if the color becoming a stigma was intentional, but it stoked many problems while leaning into and even emulating real-world practices and slurs, thus negating the fictitious racism argument. For starters, let's look at some of the descriptions given for dark elves. This is from Gemstone 4's website, and it's still on the wiki, written word for word. Dark elves can be distinguished by their sharper features and usually dark brown or black skin color. This anomaly with dark elven skin can be attributed to the Manafokai in Rosh Kator, where they were exiled to after the Undead War. They became bitter and resentful of their fair elven counterparts. They felt that their expulsion was more the result of political opportunism than anything else. Even today, dark elves are commonly shunned by their fairer brethren in the elven nations. So whenever these discussions took place on Discord and Gen Chat, all I had to do was point them at the website. And some people would argue that the website is outdated and needs to be changed. But the change is not due to modernizing the game, but rather it's due to the backlash of comments based on the lore that was written. From my perspective, this was written, went through quality control, approved, and spread to the masses, and then used ambiance and other NPCs to help establish this particular ideology. So this was not something that was a freak occurrence or a one-time thing. This is part of the lore. This is part of what makes Gemstone Gemstone. Now, is it the only thing that's attributed to Gemstone? Of course not. There's a lot of elements there. When people try to make the argument that I am making this up, I have to point to the source. and the source is confirming what I've been saying. While the game could have and should have focused more on the sorcery aspects with sharper features, it chose to make skin color the damning target. Nicknames like Dirt Elves and Darkies were comments I heard and saw from NPCs and PCs alike, and I've seen them as recently as a few weeks ago. No one is calling them Sharpies, so let's get that out the way. Restrictions in certain places highlight this ostentatious physical features. That's institutionalized racism. Some places, like Helgriff, did not allow characters in his establishment and had no trouble pointing out the reasons for doing so. Of course, the latest iteration of Helgriff's rebuff is tamer, but just as scathing. This is, in part, crafted by a world that cultivated and encouraged this behavior for years through lore or ambiance. Some consequences cannot be undone with a simple sweep of the brush. While I've only played for 5 years, I've seen my fair share of this. Characters who have played longer have experienced far worse. Many have vowed never to step foot in the East again, or hold animosity to certain cultures and factions, in character and out of character, which is a crying shame because many players and GMs are putting in good work in creating welcoming hospitality there. I have to give my love to the Tavalor Social Club, who, in one party, managed to reassure many of the outsiders and did away with much of the fears and concerns. That party changed many, many minds. But Yardie, you ask? There are fair-skinned Dark Elves. Can you explain those? Well, let's read about what they say about them. Did you know, oftentimes experiments performed by Dark Elven mothers can cause their child to have a lighter pigmentation, accounting for the dozens of light-skinned Dark Elves living in Elanthia today? Personally, I found this explanation weak at best. For starters, it says nothing about Dark Elven fathers. This is an experiment done by Dark Elven mothers, and while sorcery is a major aspect of Nuta Fandral and the Fandral culture, it makes me wonder if they were doing this to amass power, or if this was something else. For me, I took this as a passing reference when I first read it. Those who do not know, many light-skinned people of dark-skinned cultures pass, which allows them to enter segregated areas, towns, and businesses without harassment, and provided social benefits in societies where dark skin earned social harassments, restrictions, violence, and even death. The irony is that because the mechanics of race are so rigid, no fair-skinned person would be able to pass because race and culture are coded beyond appearance, and the NPC will already know their race and act accordingly. So, comically, it serves as an example of mechanical racism, to which certain raffles based on race and culture only cement that issue. Some would argue that Dark Elves as a culture dabble in sorcery, and thus, the ambiguity of said experiment allows for interpretation. That would be true if the loathing for Dark Elves had not been placed on skin color. When you have terms like Darkie supported by player and ambiance alike, lore that illustrates how cultures and races were targeted by their ear shape or skin tone, and historical context that supports how the situation ran roughshod, it becomes hard to defend. I think there's enough evidence for a person of color or a person aware of these historical issues to safely conclude that this might be racially motivated as an attempt to pass. Additionally, a light-skinned person who passed often receives shunning from their dark-skinned brothers and sisters. For instance, in America, passing provided an advantage, a safety buffer that those with dark skin did not have, and this often led to infighting between the two groups. They were often viewed negatively, and their ethnicity and experiences were scrutinized. Yet it is not limited to just America. Harsh criticism and the stigma of dark skin are regarded as undesirable worldwide. Cultures and countries like those in the Caribbean promote skin lightening because lighter skin is seen as more desirable. While Gemstone may not necessarily endorse these views, the ambiguity surrounding them doesn't help. The intentions might have been different. That is open to debate and criticism. The perception, however, is undeniable, and I wouldn't be surprised if other people of color noticed this and eventually avoided those locations or even the game entirely. The real-world tropes and conflicts of dark skin versus light skin make me think that these problems also affect Fandral, Danar, and Evershire society. When there's hostility towards half-elves, it's reasonable to assume that fair-skinned dark elves might face the same suspicion, or at least a minor degree of it, and some judgment. Since this wasn't a natural occurrence but an experiment, it may suggest shame or lack of pride in their skin color. This raises questions. Do light-skinned dark elves have their opportunities held back? Are they somewhat accepted but still limited? What about the person conducting these experiments? Are they on trial for unapproved practices? With these places hard to access, it's difficult to understand beyond what we're told, and the game never goes beyond the darkness shunning as part of their lore. Despite its harmful nature, that issue can open up opportunities for roleplay. While I never understood how the Council of Dark Elves functioned, Their idea of pan-dark elfism seems reasonable, since skin tone doesn't distinguish between Danar, Fangel, and Evashir. The finer details, like braids, runes, clothing choices, and languages, would create those distinctions. However, for those who discriminate, and for those who are receiving discrimination, none of that matters. To them, dark elf is dark elf. As a player character once said to Yardie, "They all look the same to me." Another example reflecting real life. The NPCs before some of the recent changes demonstrated that same typecasting. And that is where skin as an identifier echoes real life. So, the one thing that stands out are my sub-Saharan features and my dark skin. I'm not posting a picture of me, but for the people that have seen me, it's quite obvious that I'm black. It's not something that I just say just for the sake of saying. I'm black and I'm proud. I love myself, It's what it is. So if you heard me speak as you're hearing me now and I'm speaking English, you might think, oh, he's American. I mean, most of y'all know that I'm Haitian, but you wouldn't know that if I didn't mention it. So you would think, oh, he's American. But if I switch it up and start speaking Spanish, you might think otherwise. Pero si yo hablo español, hay gente que va a decir, oh, él es colombiano, cubano, dominicano, puertorriqueño, or something of that sort. Merci m'parler créole, abdi memba abdi oh, les haïtiens. So none of these things stand out. The one thing that does stand out is my skin color. And these same ideas are illustrated in some of the racial profiling and some of the structural racism that happened with dark elves in the East and in other places. So for every cloud, there's a silver lining. And in the harsh elements, it makes other things stand out. So something like the groups like the Fangel Enclave stand out really well. See, the Fangel Enclave takes in Fangel and half Fangel, and their belief is that if you are part Fangel, you are all Fangel. And they provide a haven and beacon of expression and education for all things Fangel. This starkly contrasts the lore, where half-elves rarely survive and are often killed in Utah Fangel. There's plenty of real estate for racial and social philosophy here, as well as societal outliers and differences that provide uniqueness to factions and the like. But none of this matters if we deny the crucial elements that have been at the heart of many battles and struggles for over millennia in Gemstone, and for a considerable time in the real world. So, if you do not have the racial tension and you deny it, things like the rescinding and the repealing of Jackson's edict don't matter. Things like the Cheyennes of Sodnara don't matter. Things like the progressive nature of King Kalinor doesn't matter. Oh, and I don't know if I'm allowed to mention other groups like the Fangel Enclave, considering histories and stuff like that, but, I still got love for them. And on the real, this is my video, so I'm going to talk about what I want. It's critique. So I give the good and the bad. So if you got a problem, you know where to find me. So, for the people that thought the Dark Elf section was a reach and the whole passing thing was just fabrication and me just trying to racially antagonize, well, take a look at the screen and look at the verbs involving half-elves, which gets into this next session. When I wrote it, I didn't know about the history that deep. And the more I learned about it, it's pretty jarring. When you throw in the Empire's history, and you throw in Chasten's edict, it illustrated the level of bigotry towards half-elves. And it's not just the human empire that did it. You have it with the Fandrils, you have it with the Valorians. I'll even touch base on the Florians in a minute. The law of Chasten's edict prevented ownership of business and property, among other things. And if you throw in the other numerous acts, and it becomes a clear definition of what the crown stands for. That's not to say that those who serve the crown or serve under the crown cannot change or grow. Nor does it mean that anyone who serves under the empire follows it aimlessly. There is always room for people to show different aspects of their character. Is it fair to hyper-focus on one culture and ignore the other? I think not. And yet here we are, held to different standards, depending on which side we affiliate ourselves with. If you look at the lore involving half-elves, it's pretty damning, and basically they seem to get it from all sides. Humans, obviously we know the history of the Empire, Chasten's edict. It's been rescinded, and you have a few half-elven baronies, but for the most part, that change is slow and steady, and it's still under a lot of racial animus, if you will. I don't expect that to change whatsoever. At least not quickly. It's only been 3 years since the rescinding of Chasten's edict, and you're trying to undo 812 years in 3 years. A little bit longer than that if you count the Valley of Gold. Elven nations tend to look at them with distaste. Half Fangel are looked with distaste as well, and in many cases in the previous lore, Fangel would basically kill them. If a half of Fangel survived, that was kind of a rare thing. And it seems like the Sylvan were the only group that were not looking at it in terms of superiority, which is a wonderful thing to look at because it actually gives some kind of character distinction to the Sylvan culture, where they look at Sylvan as Sylvan. And man, look at these half-elven verbs. If there was any doubt of passing before, you have several examples of half-elves trying to pass by either hiding their ears or trying to make them more distinct and trying to make the elven features look. They tend to be cowarding, they tend to be fearful, they tend to have some sort of disdain and some sort of resentment towards other races and towards themselves, which is all examples of, again, internalized racism. So when we talk about the fact that this is something that doesn't exist in Gemstone, I want to point out that these verbs were created, they were written, they were approved, they were codified, they were given to every single half-elf, and they were been this way for, I don't know how long the half-elves have been in your Gemstone, but this has been for a long, long time. So when we look at these things and try to deny the history, it is damning. There are a lot more examples that I can mention. I would argue that there are very few cultures that have gone unscathed in this. The Fandral-Human War started with a prophecy leading to an attack by the humans on the Fandral that caused those dominoes to fall. You had the Dwarven Giantman War. You had descriptions of certain cultures that are suspect at best. And you have examples of bigotry that are accepted by players as long as it does not pertain to themselves. Typically, the NPCs are the recipients of this. The Kiraman are a prime example of maliciousness and bigotry, and their enslavement of the Elatoi is almost universally seen as a negative. It is clear that what they are doing, the Kiraman, is wrong, cold, and calculating. And so, there are characters who hate the Kiraman and want them exterminated, no matter the circumstances. The same can be said for the Krovan and their practices of slavery, their brutality, their quest for claiming the waters, and the multitude of characters that have their bios crafted with some sort of involvement. These two groups are seen as evil, with little care for their perspective, save for a few GM-led NPCs. And this makes sense, as the actions of these sort are unacceptable. And, in turn, many other player characters are racist towards these groups. The Blue Sulphur storyline saw many characters comfortably call for the genocide of the Krovan. It is a vicious cycle, cultivated by events in lore and events created by characters to fashion their story. There's really nothing wrong with this. Many are accepting this when it comes to NPCs. So there's no need to pretend how we arrived here and what exists. On a brighter note, there have been many attempts to make improvements and foster change. I will not say that GM Wireman lied about his statement, nor will I say that the others on staff and other players have done nothing. That would be fundamentally untrue. And I thank those that have made those efforts and put in some hard work. But that hard work gets undone if people creating a welcoming world say that these problems are in the past or over, or that they never existed at all, and they demand that these people that are making these complaints or levying these concerns need to move on, or accuse them of being in their feelings and just being in their heads. It's dismissive, and it negates the effects of the long game. Let's consider the effects of the Griffin Sword Saga. From my understanding, that took place nearly 2 decades ago. And still, there are people that hold grudges, ill will, and hurt from that story. And yet, those people are often showered with hugs and sympathies. The race issue, in my opinion, is different because many are unable to agree that there was one in the beginning. I attribute this to a lack of a viewpoint from a person of color's perspective. Whether it is unintentional or deliberate remains in question. However, it is undeniable that voices like myself and others remain buried under the guise of aid. Racism is a conflict found in many games and forms of media like EverQuest, Baldur's Gate 3, Triangle Strategy, Dungeons & Dragons, X-Men, Alien Nation, just to name a few. I believe these games and these stories were successful because of the creation of their lore, their understanding of the stories they aim to tell, and the desire to craft narratives that address these themes. The most successful ones laid the foundation, set clear rules, and explored these topics. As a person of color, it is frustrating that conversations with those who might not be aware often result in an out-of-sight, out-of-mind attitude due to the discomfort these topics cause them. They get the chance to escape, and then expect others to do the same, claim that they are less affected, that it's not a big deal. It's not the same for people like me. While turning off one's mind may seem practical to some, the details in how people operate and tell their stories can reflect aspects that others relate to. Gemstone 4 definitely leaned heavily into racism. The barriers are laid, the fence is laid, and to break them down, if you want to, you need to open your eyes and recognize them first. Once you do, you can move forward. If not, then someone might get caught in the crossfire. Respectfully, I refuse to turn my brain off or stay silent for the benefit of others who dismiss these issues as insignificant. I'll end this video with a quote from Stan Lee. From time to time, we receive letters from readers who wonder why there's so much moralizing in our mags. They take great pains to point out that comics are supposed to be escapist reading and nothing more. But somehow, I can't see it that way. It seems to me that a story without a message, however subliminal, is like a man without a soul. In fact, even the most escapist literature of all, old-time fairy tales and heroic legends, contain more unphilosophical points of view. At every college campus where I may speak, there's as much discussion of war and peace, civil rights, and the so-called youth rebellion as there is of our Marvel mags per se. None of us lives in a vacuum. None of us is untouched by the everyday events around us. Events which shape our stories just as they shape our lives. Sure, our tales can be called escapist, but just because something's for fun doesn't mean we have to blanket our brains while we read it. Excelsior, Stan Lee.